Welcome to Cincy Reform. This is Pastor Brandon. I am the pastor of Christ Reformed Church in Florence, Kentucky. And today we're going to continue our conversation about the story of education, discipleship, and catechesis. And we've been laying some pretty foundational work, speaking about how God created everything. And so whatever we're looking at, we want to see God's original meaning for whatever he created. We spoke about the image of God. We spoke about natural and supernatural revelation, or special and general revelation, and how they go together. And we spoke about the human mind and how the human mind is supposed to learn by thinking God's thoughts after him. And we also spoke about the antithesis that came about with Genesis chapter 3 and how Christian and non-Christian viewpoints are in principle completely antithetical to one another. But yet there's common grace insights because those principles do not get fully realized, you could say, in this life. And so unbelievers and non-Christians, they know true things. They uncover various things and create technologies and so on and so forth. And so there's much to learn from our non-Christian neighbors. But first, as we talked about, applying the antithesis and then seeking common grace insights. And so with that kind of foundational structure in place, and now we can kind of jump into the Bible and look at the ways in which we see education and discipleship really fleshing itself out. And today we want to look at the Old Testament. We want to look at the Old Testament education, and also a little bit into the intertestamental period, and that's the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we're looking at, how did the Jews of the Old Testament, and even into that Second Temple period, how did Jews view education? How did it function? What are some things that we can learn from it? And there's a couple really great works that are out there that really have unpacked well the whole Jewish Old Testament education system. One work is by Fletcher, Harper, Swift, and he wrote a book called Education in Ancient Israel, and that looks from the earliest times in the Old Testament, the earliest times all the way up to AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. And then another work by Drazin, he wrote a book called The History of Jewish Education, and he's looking at the Jews from about 515 BC to 220 AD. And so these two works have been really fundamental in showing from Old Testament and onward what the Jews thought about education, how it was practiced. And so I want to interact with some of what they present in these books to kind of give us a sense of some of that ancient way of educating, and then also thinking also about some application for us today. And I think one of the first things that we want to say about education in the Old Testament amongst God's people was that religion penetrated everything. Religion penetrated a whole host of things. In fact, Swift said, it is impossible of treating religious and moral education apart from training and instructing in other fields. In other words, religion just penetrated all of life. It was just that there was no divide. In our day and age, we often kind of divide between the secular and the neutral, and then and that's on the one side, and then on the other side is religion and Bible stuff. And so we kind of live this great divide out where Monday through Saturday, you're not allowed to talk about religion in the public sphere, and then we just kind of live in this secular neutral realm. home. And then on Sunday, we put our Christian hat on and we go to Sunday school and we talk about Jesus and these things and learn about the Bible. And then Monday comes and we go back to just learning about secular, neutral, bare math or science or history or philosophy. And that just wasn't in view at all with God's people in the Old Testament. That wasn't in view. They didn't have that sharp divide in their minds. When they're thinking about God and His Word and God and His world, of course they went together. And so if you're going to be studying math or science or history, all of that for the early Jew is going to be connected to sacred scripture. And of course, the educational kind of flavor within Judaism had some shifts. I mean, if you think about the Old Testament and you think about God's people prior to exile, that was kind of one period of time. Then you think about God's people during the exile when they were in Babylon or Syria. And then you think about God's people when it was after the exile, when they're allowed to go back into the land again and rebuild the temple again. And so education in those kind of three arenas looked a little bit differently. But there did arise a kind of elementary school program. Now, for many years, the younger years were basically homeschool, and that was kind of, you were homeschooled until a certain age, and that was just kind of the program. That there did develop an elementary school, especially after the exile, and they kind of divided the child into three different periods. They had the period of infancy, the period of childhood, and the period of adolescence. The period of infancy was years 1 to 6, childhood was 6 to 12, and adolescence was 12 and up. And so during those years of infancy, you were with the family. So years 1 to 6, that was homeschool. That was the time where parents, members of the family, would instruct. And a couple things that they would be really focusing on in their homeschool curriculum was the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They would instruct on the Shema, on national creeds. They would teach Bible verses. The book of Proverbs was actually a textbook. Then they would walk through the book of Proverbs. They would memorize prayers that they would say together at the temple, hymns, Psalms, Bible stories throughout the Bible, and that was kind of the infancy stage of years 1 through 6. In the childhood years of 6 through 12, that was when you went to the elementary school. And there was a elementary school teacher called a Hazan. And during those early years, you would memorize large portions of the Old Testament, especially in the Pentateuch. And you would begin to, memorize those, learn those in the original language. And then the next period was adolescence, 12 and up, and that's where you went to what they called a scribe school, where a scribe or a sopharim would instruct you. And that was instruction in advanced theology, advanced writings, advanced oral teachings and these kinds of things. And so that was kind of the trajectory in the program. And during this program, during this educational endeavor, again, religion was penetrating everything, and religion not only penetrated everything, but religion was chiefly studied. It was one of, as some have said, the queen of the sciences, or the first among equals. It was not just something that permeated math, science, history, and philosophy, but it was something that you studied head on, you memorized head on, you learned advanced theology, you did all of these things, and it was a chief subject matter as well as the integrating force as well. And this is because all knowledge is one. All knowledge is unified. If God created everything, then everything is unified because its interpretation goes and is connected to, in some way, shape, or form, to God who created it. All knowledge is united in that way. Swift said, "No sharp distinction can be made in post-exilic Jewish education between the intellectual, moral, religious, and civic elements." And so everything is just united in terms of their study. And so memory was emphasized in Jewish education. In our modern day, we like to kind of downplay memory. And when you read books on education, they often will decry, rote memory and how terrible that is, how bad memorizing things is, and how boring, and we just need to be engaged and not memorize anything. Well, that was not at all. I mean, it was opposite in a Jewish context. In a Jewish context, memory was one of the greatest tools. You must memorize. You must know and be able to recall from memory. And there was great stress and emphasis placed on memorizing these things, not just knowing about them, not just having some acquaintance with theology in the Bible because you read you glanced at it once, but no, it was you had to have working memory of those things that you're learning. Swift said, "No doubt Hebrew education, like that of every other Oriental people, made great demands upon the child's memory." End quote. And what also gave trajectory to Jewish education was when they went into exile, when they were around, for example, more pagan thought, when they were around Greek thought and other thought, as they interacted with a pagan people in various lands, that actually shaped a little bit because they oftentimes rejected. They did not want to conform to the ways around them, and they wanted to retain who they were as a Jewish people. Swift said, "Jews not only remained indifferent to physical, aesthetic, and intellectual interests of their pagan conquerors, but they studiously excluded themselves from their schools and from their ambitions." And some people wonder if maybe there was an overreaction, because if you were captured by an enemy and they took you to the enemy land and they're trying to get you into an enemy school and they're showing you all the things that they're excited about, well, there's that natural reaction where you don't want to be excited about what they're excited about, and you don't want to go to their school, and you don't want to learn their things. And so there grew in the Hebrew curriculum actually a hostility toward physical education. Swift said, "The faithful Jew looked upon the Greek physical sports with abhorrence, and the establishment of the Greek gymnasium, far from introducing physical training into Jewish education, it led them to identify physical education with paganism and a consequent hostility to it." So as they were seeing how their Greek neighbors were so excited about the gymnasium and competition and physical strength and fitness and all of these things, it actually caused them to reject it as paganism. And you didn't find that in any of their schools, and they wouldn't allow it in any of their schools. So you can see perhaps there may be a bit of an overreaction there, responding then to their captors. And I think that we can understand why. So as we think about Judaism in the later years, there was a bit of a development with the school system. The Jews first made schools for higher learning. They wanted to make the scribes and make the specialists in law and so forth. And so they were very much concerned there with establishing a higher learning center. Secondly, they established secondary schools for adolescents, so kind of the older children, to help them get them ready then for higher learning. And then thirdly came the elementary, and that was the last phase then, was making the elementary school that could then move into the secondary school and then move into the higher learning ages. And they viewed children through different stages of learning, and they divided the stages of learning into age 5, age 10, and age 15. So at age 5, you entered what they called the Mikra stage. And then at age 10, you entered the Mishnah stage. And then at age 15, you then entered the Talmud stage. Again, you're learning different things at each different level, but all subject matter is still connected to the Torah. And so there's no sharp divides there. So during that Mikra stage, again, age 5, they would study the sacred writings, the Pentateuch, the prophets, the Hagiographa, and other things. And these books would be kind of the basis of their education. And actually one of the very first books that they would launch into during those early years, from 5 years and up in the Mikra phase, as later Judaism was developing, they started with Leviticus, not with Genesis, which is interesting. And they're not 100% sure why this was the case. There's a few theories out there as to why that probably was, but no one's 100% sure why it developed like that. But the very first book you introduced your child to is Leviticus. And of course, the Bible was the textbook during the Mikra all the way up through every phase. The Bible was the chief textbook, again using, for example, the book of Proverbs as a textbook as well. And here's what Drazin said about the Bible. He says, although the Bible was the chief content of elementary education, the child was taught a number of other subjects in relation to it. The Bible, it must be remembered, was not taught only as literature. It was taught as the book of life, whose precepts and principles were divine. Religion, ethics, morality were hence the outstanding subjects of the curriculum. End quote. And then as the child was moving from the Mikra stage at age 5 to the Mishnah stage at age 10, they would continue in the Bible. In fact, Swift said when a child completed the scriptures in elementary school, he did not stop studying the Bible. On the contrary, he proceeded to study with more diligence and in more detail in the secondary school. And in the Mishnah stage, they would actually begin learning a lot of other subjects as well in connection with the Bible. So, for example, secular knowledge was brought to the child not as separate bits of knowledge, but in relation to the law. In studying, for example, the laws of permitted or forbidden foods, one learned directly or indirectly many facts of botany, zoology, physiology, anatomy, hygiene, and medicine, as may be evidenced in the extant work, the Mishnah. And so as the child in that secondary school is studying deeper the Bible, also studying how it's related to all knowledge, and including things like anatomy and zoology. And as they were launching out and learning about history, of their own history, and of geography, of where people came from and where things are geographically. And as they got into, for example, the Jewish calendar, that got them into connection with a lot of astronomy as well. And so the Bible was then kind of the launching pad to launch into these other subjects, all seeing it connected, seeing it integrated with Scripture, and that was very much key to a Jewish education. And then in the final phase, the Talmud stage, age 15 and up, again, you would press in and learn more advanced things in the realm of Bible and theology. One interesting thing about Jewish education was that it functions a little bit different from our modern day conception. As we're thinking modern day people about education, we're typically thinking about jobs and money. How am I going to work in a job? How am I going to make money and raise a family? That was only kind of a secondary idea with Jewish education. Education for the Jewish mind was to be educated in the things of God, to know more things about God and His world, and to be able to navigate the world with wisdom and the gaining of wisdom. And I think that's something that differentiates the concerns of the Old Testament and the Jewish home within Israel. They were concerned very much with the gaining of wisdom, with the development of wisdom as we navigate God's world in light of God's word. And in our modern day context, we're not so much concerned with wisdom. That in fact, when you read mission statements or goal or purpose statements for education in many secular places today, rarely would you find anything saying we exist so people can be wise and have wisdom in navigating the world. That's not typically how we phrase things. We want, in our modern day context, to get a job and make money. But for the Jew, it was to gain wisdom. It was to learn about God, to know God, and to know about God's world. And they were concerned about that, wanting to do that, developing their minds in that way. And then separate from that was vocation. And with vocation, they had more of an apprenticeship model. So in other words, you went to school to be educated, and then you went to the apprenticeship to find out what you're going to do with your life and make money. And so those were kind of two separate concerns there. One is gaining education, being wise, learning God, learning God's world. Then secondarily, where do you fit in that world, and what are you going to do? And then you would go to an apprenticeship, and somebody would show you how to do things in whatever realm you chose. And as Jewish education progressed, and as the rabbis are thinking more about it and writing more about it, there was another classification that some of the rabbis gave, and it's kind of interesting, where they were speaking about the intelligence of their disciples, and they spoke about 4 types or 4 phases. So for example, they said that there are the sponges, the funnel, the strainer, and the sieve. The sponge absorbs everything. And so that's the early phase of learning. And you probably, if you have children, you know that their minds are like sponges. And they absorb a lot of information. It's interesting that it goes all the way back to some of the early Jewish education and some of the early rabbis writing and saying, hey, these early years, and they even classified it as the sponge, because that is how the mind of children function. After the sponge, you get the funnel. Drazin says, which takes in at this end and lets out at the other end. In other words, you not only absorb, but you can actually parrot it back. You can speak it back. After the funnel, then you get the strainer, he said. And the strainer, he says, lets out the wine and collects the lees. So you get this idea that the strainer is able to sift through it, kind of differentiate things, compare things. You have a kind of a higher level of understanding and of knowing, where you're able to interact with what you're learning to parrot back the best, as it were. And then that final phase they call the sieve, which extracts the coarsely ground flour and collects the fine flour. So you're kind of honing your skills on being able to discern, being able to synthesize, being able to analyze, to evaluate, and so you're working at some of those kind of higher learning arenas. It's interesting to compare what some of these early Jewish rabbis were saying about the kind of phases of childhood development regarding learning, with then what some have said more in a more modern era. For example, Dorothy Sayers, where Dorothy Sayers used the trivium of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. She used the trivium as to kind of say a lot of the same things here, but to use them as developmental phases within education. And so interesting to see how some of the seeds of that already embedded in the ancient Jewish way of thinking. Drazin also brings up an interesting point as well, something that Swift brought up about when they were interacting with pagan thought, especially the thought of their captors and how they kind of rebelled against various things. But Drazin brings up that one of the critiques that some of the Jews would levy, for example, when they were reading some of the early Greek philosophers and Greek ideas, certainly there's some at least surface level parallels with some things that the philosophers have said within the Greek thought, and some that the Jewish writers have said. And one of the arguments given by the Jews was that the Greeks were actually borrowing from their teaching that they got even earlier. So they were actually saying that no, the Greeks were borrowing from interacting with us hundreds of years prior, and it's made its way through their lineage down to here, and now we're getting Greek thought. And so kind of interesting, this argument of borrowed capital from a historical perspective. But as the Jews are thinking about and writing about education and how they're practicing education, it's interesting how they began to think about engaging those early childhood years. Because those early childhood years are vital years. And God even speaks about how vital it is and how we ought to be motivated to teach our children, as he said in Deuteronomy 6, teaching of them when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting in your house, when you lie down, when you rise up. He talked about binding them on the as fauntlets between your eyes and as a sign on your hand and a doorpost on your house. And so these were, he wants his word, his law, Old Testament history. He wants all of that to be embedded in the child's mind and to be drilled. Drilled when you're walking by the way, drilled when you're lying down, reminded of these things over and over and over and over again, memorizing these things so that they become your ideological commitment and also the practical outworking of your life. God is very much wanting that. We see, I think, in Deuteronomy 6. But what's interesting is that within a lot of the Jewish writers, they don't capitalize on those early years. So, for example, one writer, Robert Goldenberg, he wrote an essay about the religious formation in ancient Judaism, and he surveyed the writings of Philo, who was a Hebrew philosopher, Philo of Alexandria. He also surveyed the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, and then he also surveyed some of the early rabbinic texts. And it was interesting, as he was reading Philo and the Qumran community and the early rabbinic writings, he said all essentially address adults. The widespread modern assumption that the really important formation takes place in the childhood is not so much denied in these texts, but it's ignored. All address individuals who have already learned the basic skills of literacy. All address individuals who know and accept the basic requirements of Jewish law. None is especially interested in children or especially concerned about directing the formation of that basic foundational layer which modern theories of education consistently emphasize. So it's interesting that as Jewish education is continuing and advancing, there's more writers and more communities thinking about this, there was really just no concern for those early formative years. Yes, they called them a sponge, but when it came to some of the early rabbinic texts, the Qumran community, Philo and his community, we don't see a big emphasis in some of these places within Judaism. So, again, interesting. It's hard to paint, Jewish education with a broad brush. Again, there was a lot of history from the very beginning all the way up, and there were different phases: pre-exilic, during the exile, post-exilic, into the Second Temple period. Various rabbis and scholars teaching, different communities are forming, Pharisees and Sadducees and the Essenes that are forming later on in Judaism, and all of these things are having different flavors and different emphases. But I hope today that we were able to kind of get a glimpse a little bit of some of what we see within the Jewish educational program, Old Testament and into the intertestamental period, and hopefully that'll be a good background then for in weeks to come when we jump into looking at the New Testament specifically. Next week, we're going to pause and spend more time talking about wisdom, and specifically looking at the book of Proverbs and the wisdom writings of the Old Testament. But until then, I hope that this was a helpful episode thinking about discipleship in the Old Testament. This is Pastor Brandon. You can listen to our other podcasts at cincyreformed.org. And until next week, have a blessed day.